trilogy of questions that students of the Bible will always pose to the Scriptures. And the first question that students of the Scriptures want to pose is, what is the meaning of the passage? What is it that God is trying to say to us? Now, one might answer, well, that's pretty clear. It's what it says. This is what God is trying to say to us. But the fact of the matter is that in our lives there are so many filters through which we see things that we're not always able to see what God is saying to us. Let me give you an example. On Tuesday evenings I meet with our confirmands. And so this past Tuesday I asked them to read the two scriptural passages from Matthew and Luke that have to do with the birth of Jesus. And then we began to talk about it. And Eric Mordoff said, now, you know, Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem with the donkey. I said, well, where do you see a donkey? See, there's no donkey in the scriptural passage. It doesn't exist. But we're so accustomed to seeing Mary riding on a donkey that we think it must be in the Scriptures. That got me to thinking about the creche that we have here. Well, I noticed this morning that we've got a piper. Where did that come from? I mean, I play the bagpipes. I'm glad we've got a piper, but that's got nothing to do with the story that appears in the Scriptures. Moreover, what we have here is a stable. Well, I guess that's what it looks like. But the fact of the matter is that nowhere in the Scriptures does it say there was a stable. It says Mary wrapped the babe and laid him in a manger. Well, a manger is what they used to feed animals, so there must have been a stable. But the fact of the matter is that at the time of our Lord, stables were caves. They weren't anything like this. This comes to us from medieval art, when artists of that period began to draw, to paint this scene, and they took what they understood to be a stable, and that's what we end up with. Fascinating, isn't it? There's another thing that happens in the Scriptures that's fascinating, and that is we have the Magi. And you know, in some churches as we're in the Christmas season, we see the Magi. You know, if we had, I guess, windowsills that were level and not slanted, you see the Magi kind of walking up the side of the church toward the manger. And they do that because they want to show that the Magi arrive. And then on the Epiphany, you see the Magi all around the manger. But the fact of the matter is that if we read the Gospel of Matthew, what we learn is that the Magi went into the home. They weren't at the manger. They arrived some years later, and they offer their gifts. So our perception of the Scriptures has been tinted by art throughout a thousand centuries and by what we see around us. But this is not what the Scriptures are telling us. So, what is it that God is trying to say to us in the Scriptures, in this morning's lesson? Well, one of the things we find out is that Joseph is a just man. And what Joseph has decided to do, the Scriptures tell us, is, well, he finds out that Mary is with child, and he's going to dismiss her quietly. You know, in the time of Joseph, a woman of Israel who was pregnant and not married would be put to death by stoning. But Joseph is going to put her away quietly. He is not going to bring any shame upon her. He's not going to have her put to death. He's simply going to dismiss her. And then what do we learn? We learn that an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph. Now, remember, we're accustomed to the annunciation, the announcement of the birth of Jesus as coming from whom? The angel Gabriel, right? The angel Gabriel appears to Mary and says, guess what? You're highly favored, you're going to bring forth a son, and he's going to save God's people. Gabriel appears to Mary while she's awake, and that's how the Annunciation happens. But in this gospel story, the angel, never mentioned as to who it is, appears to Joseph while he is asleep. Very different stories, aren't they? And so, what's God saying to us? What's actually being said here? What's being said is that Joseph is a just, righteous person, and he is not going to bring shame upon his betrothed. So that's the first question. question we begin to ask ourselves. But the second question that scholars of the Scriptures want to ask themselves is, what did this mean to the people who heard this the first time? What did it mean, for instance, if it's something Jesus is teaching? What did it mean to the people of the time, of the biblical period? Well, if we were Jews living at the time that this story was being told, the first thing that would jump out at us is that it's Joseph. It's Joseph, and what happens? God is speaking to him in dreams, and their minds would immediately have gone to Joseph. Remember Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat? Joseph, whose brother sold him into slavery in Egypt. The brother whose 11 brothers despised him because he had the favor of his father. And what happens to him? Do you remember? He gets sold into slavery. He's taken to the land of Egypt, and he becomes a slave, a servant, in a household of a fellow who runs the prison. That's what he does. And while he's working there, or a slave there, two people are put in jail. They both work for Pharaoh. One is the baker and the other is the butcher. And they have some dreams. And they ask Joseph to tell them what the dreams mean. He says to one, well, your dream means that you're going to be in Pharaoh's favor, and by the way, when that happens, remember me. And he says to the other one, your dream is not quite as uplifting. Pharaoh's going to hang you. You're going to be put to death. And those things come to pass. But the one guy who does end up in Pharaoh's favor, he forgets the promise that he made to Joseph. And so it's 2 years down the road, and Pharaoh has some dreams. And he says to all the people in his court, who can interpret these dreams for me? And they all say, come in. There we go. Come on. There we go. There you go. He says to his folks in the court, who can interpret these dreams? And they say, well, we can't. But then this servant of his says, oh, but I remember a fellow who can interpret dreams. And so they call for Joseph. And Joseph says, well, I'm not the one who does it. God interprets the dreams. And Pharaoh says, well, the first dream is this. There are 7 fatted cows. You know, they're in good health. They look great. And they kind of come up out of the water. And they're there on the land. And then there are these 7 scrawny, ugly, cows that look like they're on their last legs. And they come up and they eat the healthy cows. But you know what? They still look emaciated. They still look sick. And then he said, and then there are these grains of wheat. And they have 3 heads on them instead of just 1. And there's abundance. And then there are this other wheat that's been scorched by the east wind. And they come up and they devour the other grains. What do these dreams mean? And Joseph said, they both mean the same thing. He said, what it means is, there are these 7 cows. There's going to be 7 years of plenty. 7 years of plenty in the land of Egypt. And that's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And therefore, what you need to do is you need to begin to plan for that time. So that when the famine comes, there will be food for the people in Egypt. And so for the next 7 years, they take some of the grain and some of the produce of the land and they put it away so that when the time of famine comes, there will be enough for the people to survive. And you may remember that what actually happens is that this is how Joseph becomes reacquainted with his family. Remember, there's famine in the land where Joseph's father and brothers are. And so they go to the land of Egypt. They don't recognize that it's Joseph who's now been put in charge of everything by Pharaoh. And it's he that's able to save his family because of what's happened in Egypt. And they're reunited. See, if we're Jews living at the time that this story is being told, what probably is happening to us is we're thinking, you know what? Here is a new Joseph and an interpreter of dreams. And just as God saved God's people in ages past, so God is intending to save us now. God has a plan to bring about salvation. And Joseph is the one who's going to reveal that to us. The third question that scholars of the Bible ask themselves is, what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with us as we live here today? Now, I guess we could take a look at the economic aspect of it and say, you know what? In times of plenty, it would be a good idea to put something aside for when there are difficult times. And I guess every couple of months, Pat and I go off with the church pension fund, and we conduct seminars, or we help to conduct seminars for clergy. And we tell them about their pensions. It's called Planning for Tomorrow. And we start to ask them to plan about their tomorrow, but not just for their retirement, even in the near term. And one of the things that always comes up is, how many of you have young children? And the hands go up. And have you started putting something aside for their college education? Because when they're 17 is not a good time to start saving for 18 years of age at college. See, during the times of plenty, put something aside so when the lean times arrive, you can survive. But I don't think that this passage is predominantly about economics. I don't think that's what it's saying to us. I think this is about spiritual truth and reality. There are times in our lives when it seems like everything is just going along swimmingly. I guess that happens every now and again, right? But then there are other times when we hit the dead ends or the places where the road becomes very difficult and very hard. Pat and I were talking again about this, and she was recounting about the death of her daughter, Andrea. One of the most difficult times, maybe the most difficult time in her entire life. And she said, and the thing that really helped get me through it is that I had a relationship with a living God. But not just that. It's that the church, the community of the faithful surrounding me, assisted me in getting through that time. And she said, there's still times in my life when there's sadness. There's still those times when there isn't much spiritually there, when I'm thinking about Andrea. There's still times of famine, spiritual famine. But I've got a relationship with God and a relationship with a Christian community. And that's what makes it possible to survive the famine. See, I think what it is that our Lord is trying to say to us, that what the Scriptures are trying to say to us is, listen, there's going to be a time of famine in all of our lives. It's part of the way life is. The time to prepare for that is not the day before the famine begins. It's to spend our lives in relationship with God in the Christian community so that when the hard